On July 17th, 2022, Eric Dickens and his girlfriend walked into the food court of the Greenwood Park Mall, which is just south of Indianapolis. And they walked into that mall in that food court rather, to take a break from their shopping and get a bite to eat. It was almost 6 o'clock in the evening, and they were hungry, so they bought their favorite food. They found the table, and they sat down there in the food court to enjoy their meal. But what Eli and his date didn't know was that an hour earlier, a young man named Doug Sapperman had walked into that same mall with a backpack on that had 2 AR-15 rifles, a handgun, and 100 rounds of ammunition. And he had gone to that same food court and walked through it. And on the far side, he had gone into the restroom on the far end of that food court. And for the last hour, he had been assembling his weapons and loading them and trying to work up the nerve to carry out his evil plan. At 5:56 that evening, as Eli and his girlfriend were enjoying their meal, Doug Sapperman emerged from hiding, armed to the teeth. And in 15 seconds, he fired 24 times at the helpless shoppers seated in that food court, and he killed 3 of them, and he wounded 2 more. Eli was only 22 years old at the time. He'd never served in the military or in law enforcement, but his grandfather had taught him how to shoot a gun. And just 16 days earlier, the state of Indiana had made it legal for Eli to carry the pistol that he had clipped to his belt. And so when Eli saw the gunman on the other end of the food court mowing down helpless victims, he told his girlfriend to get in behind a wall to get under cover. He took out his revolver, he rested it on a trash can, and in the next 15 seconds, he squeezed off 10 rounds at 40 yards away and hit Mr. Sapperman 8 of those 10 times. Sapperman tried to retreat and get back into the restroom, but he collapsed and died there in the hall with 75 rounds that he intended to use still in his weapons. July 17th, 2022 was a tragic day in Greenwood, Indiana, because 4 people died that day, including Mr. Sapperman, and 2 more were injured seriously. But even though both Eli Dickens and Douglas Sapperman took human life that day, only one of them broke the 6th commandment, because Exodus chapter 20, verse 13 does not say, "You shall not kill." It says, "You shall not murder." That is, you may not take a person's life unjustly. You may not kill them to shut them up because they disagree with you. You may not shed innocent blood to further your own cause or to make your life a little easier. You may not kill a person to vent your anger, to exact your revenge, or to take their possessions. Killing an image bearer for any of those reasons is called murder, and God explicitly prohibits it in the 6th commandment. However, not everyone who takes a human life is a murderer. When the state executes a killer, God doesn't call that murder, he calls that justice. In fact, in Romans chapter 13, verse 4, God calls those who have been appointed by the government to intervene on and restrain evil men, he calls them servants of righteousness and servants of God. And he warns evildoers that his servants carry a sword, and they do not carry that sword in vain, because when it is necessary, they have the authority from God to take an evildoer's life without breaking the 6th commandment. In the same way, God does not call lawful warfare murder. Rather, he calls it protecting ourselves and others from the murderous ambitions of other men. I'll remind you, when Jesus returns, one of the things he's going to do is go out and make war on those who know not God. But that's not murder either. When a group of soldiers came to John the Baptist and asked him, Well, what should we do to demonstrate our repentance? John didn't say, well, stop being soldiers. You're being murderers. No. He told them not to use their sword to shake down and abuse the people they served. He said, use it to restrain evil men. And when you must defend your life, or you must defend your family, or you must defend the life of an innocent person, God doesn't call that murder. He calls that having the courage to do what is just. Because as God says in Ecclesiastes 3:3, unfortunately, in a broken world like ours, there is a time to kill and there is a time to heal, but there's never a time to murder. And so when Douglas Sapperman murdered 3 innocent people while they were enjoying a meal in the food court at Greenwood, Indiana, he broke the 6th commandment. But when Eli Dickens stopped Spearman from in the middle of his killing spree, Eli didn't break the 6th commandment. He actually kept it, because he was preserving and cherishing the life of the very people that Douglas Sapperman was intending to kill. And that's not murder. That's love acting justly. Because love celebrates the worth and the dignity of image bearers, and justice protects that worth and dignity with its own life. Love says, I will cherish human life, and I will cherish it so much that I will not take it unlawfully. And justice says, I so cherish human life that I will protect it from those who do not cherish it. Love and justice are the heads and tails of the same coin. And they are the 2 virtues that drive the 6th commandment, because both of those virtues cherish life. But why does love and virtue, why does it demand that we cherish the life of a jerk? Why does he do that? Why does it do that? Why can't we just do the world a favor, and get rid of a few people who are constantly making our lives harder than they need to be? Why do we have to restrain our anger and treat nasty people with dignity and respect when they don't return the favor? I mean, they may not be threatening my life, but they're certainly threatening my happiness, and they're getting in the way of my goals. Now, if your dog starts biting you and starts biting every guest comes into your house, you're going to take him to the vet, and you're going to put him down. He's going to go to sleep, never wake up. When we were on the farm and one of our steers got too aggressive, we took him for a ride, and we turned him into hamburger. So why can't we do that same thing with nasty people? Why can't we just take them to the train station, and get rid of the problem? Well, God answered that question. God's answer to that question is that we can't do that to human beings because they're not animals. They're image bearers, and therefore we must cherish their life even when they're difficult. Not because they're good, but because they bear the image of God. And that image that they bear gives them an innate value and innate dignity that we must celebrate and we must protect. Or as our forefathers said 250 years ago in the Declaration of Independence, because we bear that image, we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. And the first of those rights is the right to life. Therefore, the 6th commandment says you cannot murder an image bearer even when that image bearer is a jerk. And that brings us to this life principle. We cherish human life not because people are good, but because they bear God's image. That's why we do it. Now, when God made the first man, the first woman, he gave them a material body and he gave them physical life, just like he did the animals. But God also gave Adam and Eve something else. He gave them an immaterial soul which distinguished them from both angels and animals. He called that immaterial soul that he placed in Adam and Eve the image of God in man, because it gave human beings the ability to reflect their Creator in a unique way, and it gave them the ability to do things that no other creature on this planet can do. And even though Adam and Eve sinned and were kicked out of the garden, they retained God's image, and they passed that image down to you and to me. And because you and I bear that image of God, we can do things that other creatures on this planet can't do. We can ponder complex thoughts, and we can feel a wide range of emotions, and then we can communicate those thoughts and feelings to God and to each other in spoken word, in written word, in poems, in music, and in songs. And because we bear that image of God, we can imagine things that other creatures don't. We can imagine things that don't exist, and then create that thing which we've imagined from the raw material that's around us in the world. And we do it just to make our life a little better. As image bearers, we have this internal moral compass called a conscience that guides our choices. Some of us listen to it, some of us don't, but we all have it because we bear the image of God, a moral being. As image bearers, eternity, we're told, is embedded in our heart, which means that, like God, you and I will exist forever, either in heaven or in hell, but we will exist forever. And as image bearers, we aren't just conscious like the animals. We are self-conscious, which means that we are painfully aware of what God and others think of us. And so we feel loved when we're affirmed. We blush when we're embarrassed, and we feel pain and regret when it's obvious that we've sinned. But the coup de grace of being an image bearer is that God has given us the ability to pass that image, the image of God, onto our children through procreation, that is, through childbirth. God doesn't create a new soul, send it down by an angel to the earth every time a baby is born. That's not how it works. No, the miraculous work of creating an eternal soul in a child is done by image bearers when a husband and a wife conceive and a new life is formed in that mother's womb. Because that new life in her womb is not a zygote, it's not a fetus, it's an image bearer. You know, when Mary visited Elizabeth in Luke chapter 1. Mary was about a week into her pregnancy with Jesus. That's how old that life was in her womb. And yet when Mary greeted Elizabeth, the Bible tells us that the child in Elizabeth's womb, which was 6 months old, leaped for joy when he came into the presence of the 1-week-old child that was in Mary's womb. And that child leaped because Mary's child was not a zygote. He was not a fetus. He was the Messiah. And one day that child in Elizabeth's womb would introduce the child in Mary's womb to the world. So every child that's growing in a mother's womb is a human being who's been made in the image and likeness of God. And therefore, that child comes under the protection of the 6th commandment. And so to snuff out that child's life because she's the wrong sex, or because he doesn't have the right IQ, or because she's just coming at an inconvenient time, that's not a medical choice. That's a moral injustice. Because that child is under the protection of the 6th commandment, which says you may not murder an image bearer. We can make abortion legal, but we cannot make it just, because whether that baby is sucking his thumb in his mother's womb or sleeping in his mother's arm, he bears the image of God, and therefore he is endowed by his Creator with certain inalienable rights, the first of which is the right to live. And that truth is enshrined in the 6th commandment. But how do we know that the reason why God prohibits us from murdering people who get in our way and tick us off is because they bear God's image? How do we know that's true? Well, to answer that question, let me take you back to the 9th chapter of the book of Genesis. Now, as you may remember, the earth became so corrupt in Genesis chapter 6 that God sent a worldwide flood to destroy that generation, and he started over with 8 people: Noah, Mrs. Noah, their 3 sons, and their wives. But we're told repeatedly in the book of Genesis that the sin that caused that pre-flood generation to go to seed is that they had a total disregard for human life. They were a violent generation that thought nothing of killing image bearers to get what they wanted. And so when the flood was over and Noah and his family stepped off the ark in Genesis chapter 9, they had a Herculean task in front of them. They had to start over and they had to rebuild a new world out of the wreckage of the flood that did not repeat the evils of that old world that God had just destroyed. And since that old world, since the total disregard for human life was one of the key things that destroyed that old world, God made respect and protection of the human life the cornerstone of his new world. Therefore, when Noah and his family came off the ark, God gave them specific instructions on how people in this new world were to treat image bearers and how they were to deal with those people who denied the worth and dignity of image bearers and just wantonly killed them. How were they supposed to deal with those people in this new world so they didn't repeat the evils of the old world? Here's what God said. And for your lifeblood, I will require a reckoning. From every beast I'll require it. If a beast kills a person, he's going to have a reckoning. And from every man, same way. From his fellow man, I will require a reckoning for the life of a man. Whoever sheds the blood of a man, by man, key phrase, by man shall his blood be shed. Why? Why is that going to happen? Why is he forfeiting his life? For God made man in his own image. That's why. Now, one of the things that made the pre-flood world such a violent place was that families just took revenge on the killer's family when someone in their family was murdered. And so if I ticked you off and you lost your temper and you killed someone in my family, then I would take revenge personally, and I'd kill somebody in your family. But then you'd respond to that, but you'd up the antes, and you'd then kill 2 people in my family. And I couldn't let that stand, so I'd respond in kind, but I'd up the antes too, and I'd kill 4 in your families and hope that you would just tap out, and not risk further escalation. These blood feuds would often escalate into an early version of the Hatfields and McCoys. For example, we're told in Genesis chapter 4 that about a man named Lamech, he was the first polygamist in the world. And he boasted to his 2 wives that he had killed a man that had wounded him in some way. Whether that wound was emotional or physical, we don't know. But he killed him for it. But he said to keep the dead man's family from taking revenge on him and his family, Lamech promised that if that dead man's family took revenge and killed someone in his family, he would respond by killing 70 people in their family. Now, such responses were not about justice. They were about power, they were about revenge, they were about control. And so when Noah came off the ark, God set up the first government as a third party between the killer and the victim to resolve such disputes in a just way. And so God told Noah that if a man is murdered, if he murdered another man, then by man, not by the family, by man shall his blood be shed. That is, the offended family does not exact their own revenge on the killer. God made that the job of a third party that we call government. And for justice to be served and for the scales of justice to be balanced, the penalty that the government imposes on the murderer must fit the crime. If I steal one of your sheep and I feed my friends with your sheep, then justice says, I owe you a sheep. And beyond that, I owe you an amends for taking something that was not mine in order to make my life a little easier. And so it's the court's job to determine the value of that sheep and the amount of amends that I must pay so that justice is satisfied and the scales are balanced. That's what that third party does. But the Bible says that if a man murders another image bearer, he can't satisfy that demand of justice by giving the offender and his family some money and making an amends. Rather, he says he must forfeit his own life. Now, why? I mean, is this just eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth? Or is there something more to this? Well, here's what God says. Whoever sheds the blood of a man, by this third party, by this appointed government, shall his blood be shed. And he says the reason why he has to forfeit his life is because God made man in his own image. You see, the question that justice must answer is, what does the murderer possess that is of equal value to what he took? And so if he laid that thing that he possesses down, the scales of justice would balance. Or to put it another way, how much is the life of an image bearer worth? Is it worth 10 sheep, 100 acres, $1 million? Because if I know what an image bearer is worth, then I can pay my fine, I can make my amends, and I can be on with my life. But here's the deal. Human beings bear the image of God, and because they do, not even a billionaire like Jeff Bezos or a trillionaire like Elon Musk has enough cash or property assets to equal the value of just one image bearer. In fact, the life of an image bearer holds such value that the only thing that a murderer possesses that is of equal value that he can surrender and balance the scales of justice is his own life, because he too is an image bearer of immense value. And so God says, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. Why? Because God made man in his own image. Because his life is the only thing that the murderer possesses that is of equal value to what he took. You see, the value and the dignity of an image bearer dictates to us how they are to be treated. And if you're having trouble figuring out just what that means, Jesus said, let me just give it to you in a simple maxim. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. We call that the golden rule. That's how image bearers are to be treated, whether they're nice or whether they're nasty. It says, whatever you wish for that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets, Jesus said. Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. That's how an image bearer is to be treated. This week I read a story, and it was a news story about a man and a woman got in a fight on the streets. Somebody pulled out of a parking spot. They both wanted a parking spot. They got in a fight about who got it. And to resolve that issue, the woman pulled out a gun and shot the guy in the street. And he died there in the street. She killed an image bearer over a parking spot. And it'll be the job of a judge and jury to determine if that was murder. And if it was, then justice says that the only thing that woman possesses that is of equal value to what she just took is her own life. And to balance the scales of justice, she must forfeit it. That's how a just world works. Now, the value and dignity that God gives to an image bearer is an amazing thing. It not only gives every image bearer the right to life, it not only protects that image bearer from the murderous impulses of others, but it even governs how we are to speak to them when they upset us. You ever been upset by an image bearer? Yeah, probably yesterday, right? Here's what God says in James chapter 3. He says, and no man can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poisons. With this tongue, we end up blessing God, our Father, our Lord and Father. And with it, we end up cursing people who are what? Made in the likeness of God. They're image bearers. The same mouth, we bless the Creator, and we curse people who bear His image. And He says, my brothers, these things ought not to be so. When we understand the value and dignity that God has infused and given to an image bearer, we will not speak to them as if they're worthless or they're worth less than us. We can say hard things to them. We can still reprove, rebuke, and encourage them with patience and doctrine. But we can't hate them. We can't speak to them with contempt, because when we do, we deny their worth, we disparage their dignity, and that, my friend, that contempt, that hatred, that is the soil from which murder springs. Murder doesn't start with an action. It starts with a hate-filled heart. It starts with contemptuous words. And that's why Jesus maintained that you don't even have to lay a hand on a person to be guilty of murder, because murder starts in our hearts. In 1975, Jody and I did a summer internship at the Bible Center Church in Charleston, West Virginia. The church was, at that time, was located on Canoa Boulevard, and there was a 3-story house located behind their parking lot that that's where we lived. There was the offices were on the first floor. There were classrooms on the second floor, and then Jody and I lived in the crow's nest up in the 3rd floor. Well, the folks at Bible Center were very good to us, and we had a great opportunity to learn from seasoned pastors in a growing church. But when the summer was over, we had to pack things up and go back to Appalachian Bible College for our final year of school. So before we headed back to college, Jody and I decided we were going to go downtown Charleston. We're going to cash our final check, and we're going to buy a few things that we're going to need when we get back to Beckley and area, or back to Bradley for college. Now, at this point in our life, we were pretty much living kind of drinking out of a straw, living on a pretty tight budget. And so when we got paid each week, rather than putting our money in the bank and just kind of paying stuff out, we'd cash our check and we'd put it into small bills, 1s, 5s, and 10s. And then we had a series of envelopes that with all our bills labeled on it. And we'd take those, and each week we would put money in each of those envelopes. So when the end of the month or the end of the quarter or at the 6-month mark, we'd have the money we needed to pay our bills. And so when we got our last paycheck from Bible Center, we went downtown Charleston, we cashed our paycheck, and we drove away with just a stack of 1s and 5s and 10s. But before we'd know how much money we had to spend on college stuff, we had to put all those 1s and 5s and 10s into their rightful envelopes so we'd know how much we had left that we could use for school stuff. So, downtown Charleston was pretty tough to find a parking spot. And so I started driving around looking for a place. And so we could take our little pile of money, put it into the envelopes. And when I finally found a parking spot, we were quite a ways away from Main Street. And so I stopped, parked the car in this, pretty deserted street. And Jody started stuffing bills into envelopes. And I started looking around at where we were parked. And I thought, gosh, this isn't a very good part of town, And so I turned to Jody and I said, how much longer are we going to be on this? And she assured me she was almost done, but it didn't look like she was almost done. She had little bills all over her lap and all over over the car, and she was, quickly putting them in the envelopes. And at about that time, I saw a guy walk by our car, and he looked down in Jody's window, and she saw all those bills all spread out in front of her. And then he went around, he walked in front of our car, and he looked right at me, and I got a weirdo vibe. And then he disappeared. He walked across the street and disappeared behind a building. And so I turned to Jody and I said, honey, put the money away. We got to get out of here. And she said, no, I'm almost done. Just a minute. Well, about that time, I saw the guy who disappeared behind the building come out from behind that. He reemerged. But he reemerged with his hand behind his back, his right hand. And when he came out, he stared straight at me with a look in his eye that said, he was up to no good. So I reached for the keys in our steering column to start the car and get out of Dodge, but I'd pulled the keys out of the ignition and I dropped them into the black hole of Jody's purse. And so I turned to her and I said, honey, I need the keys. And she again protested that she was almost done. And she just kept stuffing bills into envelopes. Well, I looked back to see what was going on with the guy across the street, and he was on the move. And he was heading straight for us with his hand behind his back. So I decided I could either fish around in that black hole and try to find those keys, or I could call that guy's bluff. I decided on option number 2. And so I didn't say a word. I just opened the door, I stepped out of the car, I looked him straight in the eye, and I started walking right towards him. I figured, I'm a pretty good-sized guy. He'll turn, he'll lose his nerve, he'll change directions. He didn't. Whatever he had behind his back, he believed that was an equalizer. He believed he could bludgeon me and take our last paycheck if he got close enough. So he just kept coming. Well, I said, well, that ain't going to work. So I turned around and I jumped back in the car. And I put my hand down in that black hole called Jody's purse. And in a Class B miracle, I came up with the keys. First attempt, came up with the keys. I stuck them in the ignition. And as I did, I saw him at Jody's door trying to get in. I dropped the car in drive, hit the gas, sped off, left him in the rearview mirror holding a pipe in his hand. Now, I didn't stop to get the guy's name, so I don't know who he was. But God does. But even though he never laid a hand on me or on Jody, and he didn't get a single cent of our money, he still broke the 6th commandment. Because he so hated me and so coveted our money that he was willing to bludgeon me to death with a pipe and steal our last paycheck. And but for the grace of God, he would have done it. That's why Jesus taught that if you want to keep the 6th commandment, it's not enough to say, I haven't murdered anybody. We also have to stop murdering people in our hearts, which means we have to slay anger, we have to slay envy, because that stuff churns inside of us. Every time somebody gets in our way, every time somebody ticks us off, every time somebody has what we want, those murderous emotions churn up inside of us. Because murder doesn't start with a gun, it doesn't start with a knife, it doesn't start with a piece of pipe. It starts in our hearts. And if we want to keep the 6th commandment, we have to slay the emotions that fuel murder. And that brings us to this second life principle. To cherish human life, we have to slay our murderous emotions. That's anger and envy. Those are the 2 big offenders, anger, envy. When Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, he pointed out that there was a big difference between just checking the boxes and keeping the letter of the law and actually intervening on our hearts and keeping the spirit of the law. To illustrate what he was talking about, he took the people back to Exodus, to our very verse, Exodus 20:13. And he said, you've heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder. That's our passage. That's the 6th commandment. And you've heard it said, whoever murders will be liable to judgment. They'll be held accountable and they forfeit their life. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother, he's liable to judgment too. And whoever insults his brother, he's liable to the council. And whoever says, Raka, you fool, that was a word of absolute derision and contempt. That wasn't just the word for fool. That was as close to a swear word as you could get. It was a word of derision, a word of contempt. He said, if you call a person Raka, then you're liable to the fires of hell. Jesus' point is pretty simple. Anger and contempt precede murder. They're the taproot from which murder springs. Before that woman ever pulled a gun and shot that guy over a parking spot, she was angry with him. She argued with him. She treated him with contempt. And she got so angry with him that she wanted to kill him. And then she did. Jesus warns us that anger and contempt are not just dark emotions. They shape how we talk to people. They shape how we treat people. Snide insults, name-calling, cruel put-downs, they're all indicators that our anger has crossed a moral line. that we've dismissed the dignity and worth of the person that's standing right in front of us, and therefore we feel entitled to treat them as if they don't matter, as if they're beneath us. And that, my friend, that is called contempt. And when our anger morphs into contempt, we have murder in our hearts. That first murder happened in Genesis chapter 4 when Cain killed his brother Abel, not because Abel threatened his life, but because God accepted Abel's sacrifice and rejected Cain's, and it made Cain so angry, he wanted to kill his brother. God specifically came to Cain and said, "Why are you angry? Just do the right thing, Cain, and you'll be accepted just like Abel was." He warned him, "Cain, if you hold on to this anger, it's going to overtake you like a wild beast. It's going to consume you. You must rule over your anger. You must slay it. And if you don't, it's going to rule over you. It's going to kill you." Cain didn't listen. Rather than slaying his anger, he fed it. He lured his brother out into a field, and he murdered him in cold blood. First murder in the Bible. See, when our anger crosses the line and it becomes hatred and contempt, we have a choice to make. We can either repent and ask the Spirit of God to slay that anger that's churning up and seething inside of us, or we can feed that anger and we can murder that person in our heart. Romans chapter 8 and verse 13 says that we have to mortify. That is, we have to kill. We have to put to death. We have to slay the deeds of the flesh, our old nature. And he says we do that through the Holy Spirit. That is, we have to listen to what the Spirit of God says. We have to depend upon His power to do the next right thing for the right reason. So when someone hurts us, we can hate them. We can trash them on Facebook. We can murder them in our hearts. We can do all those things. Or we can humble ourselves. We can forgive them. We can pray for those who despitefully use us. We can let God be our avenger. And we can slay that murderous emotion of anger and contempt so it doesn't consume us. But anger isn't the only murderous emotion we have to intervene on. The other dark emotion that we must slay is envy, because envy leads to covetousness, and covetousness leads to murder. Listen to what God says in James 4, 2 and 3. He says, you want things, but you don't have them. So what do? You murder. Envy, desire, covetousness, murder. In that sequence. You covet and you cannot obtain, so what do? You fight and you quarrel. You do not have because you don't ask. You don't ask God for what you need. And when you ask God, you don't receive, he says, because you ask for wrongly. You ask out of these evil motives. You just want to spend it, whatever you get, on your own evil desires, your own passions. So when you want what somebody else has and you resent them for having it, envy has found a home in your heart. See, envy doesn't want the same kind of thing that I possess. That's not what envy wants. Now, envy doesn't say, gee, I wish I could find a way to have what you have so we could both have it. No, that's not envy. Envy wants the very thing that you possess and resents the fact that you have it and condemns you for possessing it. An envious person deems you unworthy of your possessions, and therefore they feel justified in taking you and your stuff by any and all means. Whether it's your wealth, your wife, your home, your car, your position at work, your social status, your following on YouTube, your political clout, the envious man has weighed you in the balances, and he is sure that you should not have these things that you possess, and that he should. That is the message of Marxism, my friends. And that is the consistent drumbeat, unfortunately, of the political left in our country. And it shouldn't surprise us that violence and murder follows Marxism wherever it goes because envy is a murderous emotion, and Marxism is built on envy. 1 Kings chapter 21, we're told that a man named Naboth owned a piece of land that was adjacent to King Ahab's property. Ahab wanted Naboth's land because he thought it would be just a wonderful place to put a royal garden. And so the king went to Naboth, offered to buy his family farm, but Naboth was a righteous man who believed that the land belonged to God, and the God had entrusted to him and his family to take care of it and to provide for their family. And so he declined the king's offer. And so King Ahab did what any adult would do. He went home, resented Naboth, and pouted. When Ahab's wife Jezebel realized that Naboth had turned down her husband's offer, she was incensed that a lowly Israelite had denied the king of Israel his request. So she set up an elaborate scheme to discredit Naboth, to have him murdered and take his land. First, she threw a big party and made Naboth gave him the seat of honor. And when all eyes were on Naboth, she bribed some unscrupulous people to publicly accuse him of cursing God and the king. And then she set up a kangaroo court, found Naboth guilty of blasphemy and treason, and had him stoned. And once Naboth was dead, Ahab seized Naboth's land, turned it into that garden that he envisioned. Everything seemed great until Elijah showed up. And that prophet told Ahab and Jezebel that they would pay dearly for their envy, for their murder, and for their theft. And as a result, Ahab stepped into battle, and some archer pulled back a bow and just shot an arrow into the air, and it struck Ahab and killed him in his chariot. Pop shot. Killed by a pop shot. Directed by the hand of God. Jezebel died when she was betrayed by her guards. They threw her off the top of a city wall, and dogs devoured her. I think it's safe to say Ahab would have been much better off if he just humbled himself, just accepted Naboth's no, been content with what God had given him. Because humility and contentment will put a dagger in the heart of envy. But pouting, resentment, character assassination, all those things feed envy. We say that a person like Ahab is green with envy because it was once believed that if you were envious, you were just full of bile. And that bile would turn your skin into a yellowish green. Now, I don't think that envious people are full of bile, but envy will make you sick. It'll make you sick with hatred. It'll make you sick with greed. And when envy is allowed to have its way in your heart, the ultimate result of envy is murder. It's breaking the sixth commandment, either in your heart or in reality. Yeah, we're living in a time in which anger and envy are just running rampant in our culture. And as these murderous emotions spread across our nation, so does violence and so does murder, because envy is a taproot of murder. Louis Mangione murdered Brian Thompson in cold blood, shot him in the back in the streets of New York. Why? Because he was CEO of an insurance company that Mangione hated. He hated their policies, so he killed their CEO in cold blood. Tyler Robinson murdered Charlie Kirk. Why? He said because he hated him. He hated him, and he envied his political and social influence in America. Thomas Crook tried to murder President Trump at a political rally in Butler, PA, because he simply disagreed with him. In a recent poll revealed that nearly 40% of our young people, ages 18 to 29, nearly 40% of them believe that political violence, including murder, is sometimes justified simply because the other person disagrees with me. That belief is 4 times higher in young people ages 18 to 29 than it is with people my age. So why does that disparity exist? Why do so few people in my era hold that and so many in this next generation just to reject that, and so many in this next generation embrace it? Well, at least part of the answer is that our culture is systematically filtering Christian values and Christian teaching out of our kids' lives. It's not accident, it's intentional. A recent study examined the 300 books that the top 25 publishers in America were promoting and encouraging our young people to read. How many of those books do you think dealt with the values and the virtues of Christianity and the Christian roots of our nation? How many of those 300 touched on that subject? 0. Out of 300, none of them, nada, zip, not one of them touched on those subjects. Our kids, our young people, our next generation know more about Karl Marx and communism than they know about Jesus Christ and the Christian roots of their nation. And as a result, we are producing a generation of Americans who are struggling. They are struggling to find meaning and purpose in this world. And they're willing to kill you if you disagree with them. And those facts are not going to change just by pointing that out. They're only going to change when we change. Our culture has made it their business to filter out the fact that we have a creator, the fact that we're made in the image of God, the fact that we have possessed certain inalienable rights because we are made in God's image. And at the top of that list is the right to life, whether you're in the womb or whether you're in hospice care. God has enshrined that right in the 6th commandment, which says, "You shall not murder." And therefore, you and I, we must cherish the life of the person standing in front of us, even when they tick us off, even when they are a jerk, even when they give us heartburn, even when they have things we don't have. Not because they are good, but because they bear God's image. And we must make it our business to starve out and slay the murderous emotions of contempt and envy that live and churn up in our hearts so that we can love our neighbor and protect him from injustice, the injustice of evil men, rather than hating him and murdering him in our hearts. That's a big task. And to pull it off, I suspect that there's probably some grudges you're going to have to let go of. There's probably some anger you're going to have to quit justifying. There's probably some people that you're going to have to forgive. Maybe your problem is not anger. Maybe your problem is envy because it just bugs you that other people have it better than you do. And if that's you, it's time to humble yourself. It's time to be grateful for what God has given you. It's time to find contentment in such things as you have. Contentment and humility plunge a dagger into the heart of envy, and it will free you to love your neighbor rather than to murder him in your heart. But the real test of whether you've laid down your anger and your contempt, whether you've killed envy and resentment in your heart, the real test is, can you pray for those that you once wanted to murder? Can you pray for those that you once murdered in your heart? There's probably somebody you've been on your mind all the way through this message. It just keeps popping up. God keeps poking you and says, what about this guy? Oh yeah, he's a jerk. Well, my challenge to you is every time you think about that guy or that gal who's been giving you heartburn and making your life tough, why don't you pray for them instead of hating them? Not because they're good, but because they bear the image of your Creator, just like you do. And if you'll pray for those who despitefully use you, you will slay the murderous emotions that churn up inside of you and make you want to be a murderer in your heart. If you slay those emotions, you'll keep the 6th commandment. And God will say, well done, good and faithful servant.